Hi everyone, Sajid Amit here and welcome to my review titled Best Headphones of 2023 and How Not to Drive Them. So of course this discussion is about a ranking of the top 10 headphones as of December 2023. My subjective ranking, of course, it could well vary from your ranking, and of course these top 10 headphones will not cover everything that's out there. It won't cover the Shangri-La Senior from HiFiMan, which I'm yet to hear. It won't cover the Sennheiser HE1 because I think that headphone is way, is priced way out of the sort of, generic price point of like $1,000 to $6,000, which I think is basically the price range in which most top headphones fall. And I won't be covering the Warwick headphones for the same reason. The Warwick Aperio is very expensive. So these are the top 10 headphones insofar as headphones that most people aspire to own or most people actually end up owning. And my top 10. And I will talk a bit about why my number one headphone in some cases can be tweaked to beat the Shangri-La Senior perhaps, and certainly the HE1. The Shangri-La Senior I don't want to comment too much on because the Shangri-La Senior is a headphone that I think a lot of people are yet to hear. The HE1 tends to be something that captures people's imagination more, and people who go to Can Jams have heard the HE1. So these are my top 10 guys, and I'll be ranking them soon, and I'll also talk about how not to drive them. In case you want to get something more than a ranking and you want to understand, you want to buy one of these headphones and you want to understand how to drive them or how not to drive them. So my top 10 will include the Ral SR1A, which is this headphone, and the most recent rendition of the SR1A is the SR1B, which is just a cosmetic change to the SR1A. It will cover the ZMF Caldera, which is a very, very well-loved headphone and perhaps the best ZMF headphone till date. It will cover the Focal Utopia 2022 version. A lot of you might have seen my Focal Utopia video. That was from the OG Utopia, and I love that headphone. This I like even more. I'll talk about the Stax SR99S. I'll talk about the Stax X9000, which I think for a lot of people is the king of headphones. And I'll talk about my take on its ranking and where I place it. Of course, the ZMF Atrium closed, which I do think is the best closed back on the planet, although that might be disputable because some people might like the Stelia more or the VC from ZMF more. The Aria Organic, which I think is just a fantastic headphone. The Susvara, of course. The BIS AB12665TC and the HE1000 SE. So that's my top 10 guys. Now to rank them. My number one headphone on this ranking perhaps will not be a surprise to most of you is the HiFiMan Susvara. Susvara is now like a sort of a catchword even because some people will say, oh, this IM is a Susvara of IMs. Some people will say this is the Susvara of DAPs or Susvara of amplifiers. Susvara is now synonymous with the best because it is. Now, this is of course subjective and Susvara is not without its flaws. I do think it presents soundstage in a very strange way where you get a lot of depth, but you also get sounds coming from very close to your ear. So it's got this strange sort of a soundstage, and it doesn't have the most amount of bass impact. So none of these headphones in the top 10 are flawless. Nothing is. If you think $6,000 will get you into flawless territory, nothing will. Even the HE1 has flaws. I don't think it has a wider soundstage, for example. Susvara requires a lot of power, guys. You see this being driven by a Pass Labs setup. So this is a Pass Labs power amp, a speaker amp, the XA25, which is not the most powerful from Pass Labs. It's 25 watts. However, it's wonderful because speaker amps tend to not be current limited. And these planars do come alive when you feed the planar the right amount of current. And the most ostensible manifestation of a Susvara being driven well is that it doesn't sound as poofy in the bass. It still doesn't rumble and punch like an Abyss, for example, or an LCD4. But a Susvara is often recommended that it be driven from a power amp, and this is a preamp, of course, the XB12 from Pass Labs. This setup is $12,000. You don't need a $12,000 setup to drive Susvara. Even a topping D90 DAC was fantastic with Susvara, and a topping A90 amp back in the day was decent. Of course, you're going to unlock a lot of performance with better amps, and there are amps that go up to the $15,000 range, $20,000 range, so you take your pick. Nowadays, a lot of people who are spending insane amounts of money have come back to me and said that they like their DCS Rossini with the Master Clock with Susvara, which is a $30,000 plus DAC, and the new Mass Kobo 475 amp, which is like a $20,000 amp. But I do not recommend all that, of course. I do think you can eke out wonderful performance even from a HiFiMAN Prelude amplifier or a HiFiMAN Serenade DAC amp. And if you were to combine the HiFiMAN Serenade DAC with the Prelude amp, you would get like very close to maximum performance with the Susvara. So, guys, what you do with your money in terms of amp rolling is up to you. But Susvara is, I think, the best headphone because it doesn't have major flaws. It's one headphone that sounds analog, which is important to me. I'm a very analog kind of guy. So this matters to me. I like air frequencies, and this has air frequencies. Wonderful vocal intimacy, and a deep sound stage. Overall, Susvara is my number one because I do think it will cater to the highest number of audiophiles in terms of being able to be driven off, different sources, changing color according to sources. It offers some tweakability, which I like. I think it's also my number one because it can be used to play a variety of genres. It doesn't perform the best with rock and metal, but you can tweak the DAC, for example, to bring more sort of upfrontness to the sound. Like a Topping D90 has a very upfront sound, which I do think works with rock and metal. Now, a super expensive version of the Topping D90 is the Y-Stack 501, 502, which again can be used with the Susvara to give it punch and slam. Again, not to the same degree as an Odyssey LCD4 or an Abyss, but this is a tweakable headphone, guys. And you can use it to run or drive any kind of genre with it. So that's why Susvara is my number one. Now, Susvara is, of course, a lot of people's number one. My number two is going to be the Stax X9000. This is, for a lot of people, the best headphone on the planet. And I dwelt a lot on whether the Susvara or the X9000 should be my number one. I finally came to the conclusion the Susvara, I think, is a better option. The X9000 might be even more resolving than a Susvara. It's got decent bass for an E-Stat. I don't think the bass, although it sounds punchy, does have the same sort of texture as a planar bass does. That said, it has an enormous soundstage, and perhaps it's also tweakable. So if you have the right sort of chain with it, even if you have like a T8000 amp, which is an expensive amp, of course, but it doesn't, compare to an Exonic T2 or a lot of the other more fancy amps that are coming out. Head amp has an amp coming out that I think will be priced at $20,000, right? So because you need to get an E-Stat amp, which is like a very dedicated, very specialized sort of an amplifier, I have decided to rank it 2 and have the Susvara rank 1. Although this is as much of an all-rounder, this is one Stax that does bass well. I know the 007 permutations from Stax do bass well, but those headphones, the 007 Mark 1 and Mark 2, have a bit of a bloated bass that I think lacks a bit of tightness. This bass actually is quite tight. The mid-range is slightly pulled back, which I think further enhances the soundstage depth effect, and it has a very lovely treble. It's not as sparkly as a Stax SR009, which for a lot of people is the epitome of Stax sparkle and sort of the ethereal sound. In many ways, it's slightly less ethereal than a 009, and is perhaps more comparable to a planar sound in the fact that it's a slightly more dense sound, which I like. I like the fact that this has slightly more meat on the bones than the ethereal Stax sound, which a lot of people love. But this to me is my number 2. But again, this requires amplification of a very specific type. It does change its character a lot with the DAC. Stax headphones will reveal your DAC's attributes like no other. Guys, my number 3 headphone is none other than the Focal Utopia 2022 version. The Focal Utopia was one of my favorite headphones because I honestly consider it to be an all-genre headphone. It's a very interesting frequency response because it has a sub-bass roll-off, which doesn't really affect how you perceive the bass, because with certain amps and DACs, the sub-bass roll-off just sounds less evident. And it has a whole lot of punch and slam, although the FR, the frequency response, will not betray this. So, I mean, guys, I get all these comments that keep talking about FRs as a be-all and end-all, and I don't think I alone will be able to shake that perception of audiophile noggins. Audiophiles, a lot of them are convinced that the FR is the be-all, end-all. If you see the Focal Utopia 2022 FR or the Focal Utopia OG FR, what you shall find is that it doesn't have anything in the FR to suggest that it would slam as hard as it does. Focal headphones slam hard, and for that I love this headphone. Even the texture and quality of the slam, the macrodynamic punch, is so on point that it does, to me, to my mind, beat out the slam that you get from planar like the LCD4. Because when you hear of an LCD4 or an AB1266 5TC slam, you sort of get like this powerful slam that I think lacks a bit of decay. With dynamic driver headphones, the slam is decidedly more natural, especially with the case of the Focal Utopia. And the 2022 version is even better because it doesn't have the treble sharpness, and it sort of, tones down on the metallic sheen that sometimes the Utopia treble can have. Metallic sheen also goes away with like sources like the Sony W1 ZM2, which is a lovely, warm analog source. This is a super pairing, and another reason why I rate the Utopia as my number 3 is because it can be driven off anything, guys. A DAP like the Sony, which is not the most powerful DAP on the planet, drives this with perfection. Takes to tubes. So a lot of tubes amplifiers are recommended for the Utopia. The best I've heard is perhaps the Felix Euphoria Anniversary Edition. Okay, the Utopia is a wonderful headphone, like I think a lot of people agree. But moving on, number 4 for me, is the ZMF Caldera. ZMF is synonymous with great craftsmanship, with heirloom level quality of headphones, with just the best possible design. People spend hours on ZMF websites trying to pick the color that they want. These headphones get sold out within minutes. ZMF November was just upon us, and ZMF in the month of November every year publishes, or rather releases, some of the most beautiful headphones on the planet. Beauty aside, their headphones sound great. Now, I have a friend who owns a Shangri-La Senior who thinks the ZMF headphones are mid-fi. Yet I'm sure even he will have heard the Caldera and will admit that Caldera is not mid-fi. It is at the same level of technical performance as the best headphones on the planet. It is not a $6,000 headphone, but ZMF, I think, does give you a whole lot of bang for your buck with this headphone. It sounds more analog often than a lot of planar headphones do, because it does have dynamic driver sort of sound. And I think it sounds natural, it's punchy, it's just got the best vocals, and the vocals are reminiscent of the ZMF house sound. It is by far the best ZMF, and in my comparison video between the Susvara and the ZMF Caldera, I also claimed the Caldera perhaps has a blacker background, although it might sort of trail the Susvara in terms of resolution by just a bit. It is a phenomenal headphone, guys. The Caldera is great. It works with solid state. With tubes, you get a different sound of sound. With solid state, you get a different sound of sound with tubes. With that, moving on to my number 5. My number 5 will be a lot of people's favorite headphone, which is the Abyss AB1266 5TC. A lot of people will swear by this headphone because this headphone has the resolution almost at the same level of a Stax. This has a soundstage of some of the best headphones of the planet. This has more punch and slam and a bass that a lot of people consider to be the best bass on the planet. It does have some weaknesses. Its mid-range is slightly recessed and dry. Its treble can be a bit problematic, zingy for a lot of people. However, if you can tweak your chain enough, like if you had a Holo Audio DAC, like a Spring or a May, it does shave off the edge from the treble. And then, if you don't want to spend a lot of money, but a decent amount of money, the i5 Pro iCan does have the effect of bringing out its mid-range a bit more. So it does sound a little more dense, a little more analog, and a little more less recessed, rather, in the upper mids. So you can fix this headphone, although I'm not suggesting this needs fixing. It's just that if you want it to become more of an all-rounder, you can tweak its cable, its source, and make it into more of an all-rounder, which I have talked about in the past, which is why I have the Holo Audio May in the back. The May with the Abyss is just wonderful. I did not like the Abyss when I first listened to it. It's got a very strange form factor. It's got, questionable ergonomics. Some people do like it and grow into it, but it's heavy. It's heavy, and it does cause discomfort for people who don't like heavy headphones. But that being said, it is wonderful in resolution. It has a sort of an out-of-the-head sort of imaging and staging, which just works fantastically with live music. And if you are a rock head or a metal head, you might even get upset at me for ranking this at number 5. You might be asking, why isn't this number 1? So it can be. I'm not saying it won't be number 1 for everyone or for someone, but for me, it's number 5, guys, for reasons I've stated, like its mid-range, its weight, and its form factor. So, guys, the Abyss is my number 5. So you might be wondering, what's number 6? My number 6 headphone is none other than the Ral SR1A, which nowadays is called the Ral SR1B. A headphone that is phenomenal in its technological prowess, its technical ability, but by no means perfect. It's not perfect because it has an incredibly obvious sub-bass roll-off. It lacks a bit of slam and punch, and it can be bright for a lot of people. However, it is the most wide-sounding headphone. It beats the Abyss and the Sennheiser HD800 or even the Aria for soundstage width. It's deep, its imaging is just pinpoint, and its resolution, I think, is something that I think even Stax headphones cannot live up to. It's a ribbon headphone after all, and it's light and ergonomics. All these things I think are wonderful. Its form factor is strange, so it won't cup your ears. It's not circumaural. However, it's great if you don't mind a slightly unconventional form factor. Now, I have managed to get the maximum sound quality out of this by tweaking the chain. So I do want to talk about what chain I drove it with that gave me the best possible sound of the Ral SR1B. The best possible sound I got from the Ral SR1B was again with the Holo Audio MADAC, which I think pairs extremely well with these extremely resolving planars and ribbon headphones and ESATs. The Holo Audio MADAC, by no means a perfect DAC, does pair well with this, and I used a Prima Luna Evo 200 amplifier, a tube amp with L34 tubes, which not only made the mid-range sweeter, the treble slightly, or well, not just slightly, but substantially less bright. It also, I think, had this interesting effect of slightly slowing down the sound and adding texture to the bass, and that added note weight to the bass just made this headphone more complete, to the point that I was able to listen to a whole bunch of rock and metal with this, which is, I think, not very easy or feasible with the SR1A or B, with most other chains. Its sub-bass, it can be an issue for some, so even some people have even, driven this off a speaker amp and a subwoofer to just get that sub-bass tactility and feel. So I don't recommend all that, of course, but you can even get the very expensive tube amp that Ral Requisites makes, which also has L34 tubes, which is a fabulous tube amp, which I've listened to, which does have the effect of making this more well-rounded and complete. Bottom line, is a very tweakable headphone. You do end up spending money to tweak it, but of course, if you don't want to spend all the way up to Holo May, you can get Holo Spring, and a Prima Luna Evo 200 is something that I think you can buy used even, but you do end up spending money, guys, to get the best out of this. It does come with sort of adapters that you can use to drive it with any headphone app nowadays. So that's that. But I do recommend spending some money to get tubes if you want to drive this, to take care of that treble edge or edginess, and also to round out the bass a bit more. Guys, the Ral SR1B is wonderful. It's my number 6, so that brings me to my number 7. And my number 7 is actually a closed back headphone. This is the ZMF Atrium closed. This is, to my mind, the best closed back on the planet. And I'm partial to good bass. This has some of the best bass on the planet. It sounds like an Abyss. It's just like hammer on anvil. But that being said, it has more texture, more decay, and a certain linger of the notes that the Abyss doesn't have. A lot of planars have very good bass and punch and slam, but I do think dynamic drivers are able to do this recreation of a bass impact and bass linger and bass sort of trailing edge of notes that I don't think planars are able to usually. So for this, I love its bass. It's perhaps the best bass I've heard on a headphone. It's got the same luscious mid-range that ZMS is famous for. It's got an extended treble that I think for a closed back in particular is reasonably extended. And it sounds holographic because of the sort of technology ZMF has. And it can be had in lovely colors. Overall, guys, I do find the Atrium to be a superlative headphone, and it's my number 7. My number 8, guys, is none other. It's my second HiFiMAN headphone on this list. It's none other than the HE1000 SE. I have reviewed a lot of HE1000 headphones. By the time this will drop, you might have seen the review of this headphone as well. I've reviewed the HE1000 Stealth. The HE1000 headphones are fantastic, but the HE1000 Stealth is not as resolving or as wide or as deep in terms of spaciousness and sound staging as the HE1000 Stealth. The HE1000 Stealth, in combining stage depth and width, I think is second only to the Ral SR1A or SR1B, which, like I said, is a ribbon headphone. These guys are wider sounding than even the HiFiMAN Aria, which is sort of the benchmark for width. A lot of people who own the HE1000 SE, I mean, some of them at least even say that this is more resolving than a Susvara, and if you hear this, you'll understand why. I'm not saying this is more resolving than a Susvara, but because the Susvara resolution is dependent on what you drive it with, and it does present resolution in a slightly more languid way, you might miss out on certain details that you'll not miss here. This is just brazenly resolving. You miss nothing in the tracks. It plays back vocals extremely well. Classical jazz orchestra is just on another planet with these. You get enormous soundstage. You get pinpoint precise imaging. I mean, I can't stop raving about the imaging and soundstaging of the HE1000 Stealth. And resolution. And it can be driven off anything. You can even use a Sony DIP to drive this and it sounds magnificent. It is a bit on the brighter side, so you do want to pair it with slightly warmer sources. So that's that. Guys, as amazing as it is, I do think at my number 9, the Hyphaman Aria Organic comes within biting distance of the HE1000 Stealth because it's almost as wide, it's almost as deep. It's got great resolution, although it's not as resolving as the HE1000 Stealth, and it has a lovely mid-range, a bit of bass punch. The Stealth is one of my favorite headphones, and I have covered this in a previous video where I said this was the headphone of the year in terms of, being the best headphone that was released this year. Granted, I'm yet to hear the Meze Imperial Mark II, which again, I don't think is as resolving as a lot of the other headphones on this list. But this is amazing, guys. So I do think it deserves this place. And because it's perhaps the cheapest headphone on this list, I mean, just kudos to Hyphaman for coming out with this level of technical performance, quality at this price point. My number 10, guys, last but not the least, is a Stax SR009S, which to a lot of people is the best headphone on the planet. I understand, but it's my number 10 because I find the 009S to be an interesting headphone. It's not as bright or biting in the treble as the 009. It does have a little more bass impact than 009, but I do think it's a lot like the Susvara, but requires a lot of expensive amplification, a very dedicated amplification that you cannot use with other sources, or other headphones rather. Like, you need an ESTAT amplifier to drive this. Plus, it doesn't have the same level of bass tactility as Susvara does, but it does beat Susvara, I think, for resolution. And treble sparkle is something people love about it. It's very ethereal sounding. So if you like that sort of ethereal sax sound, this could be your best headphone or your number 1 headphone. For me, it's my number 10, but I do respect this a lot. I do respect this headphone tremendously, but my opinion on this has changed over time. So that's it, guys. That's my number 10. I do want to very quickly talk about how not to drive these headphones, or rather how to drive these headphones. And very quickly, I have already talked a bit about this, but I'll summarize in no particular order. So L34 tubes bring this to life, and I think an R2R jack will, especially one that's on the warmer side, like a Hollow Audio May. ZMF Caldera can be driven with everything. You can get a tube to make its stage deeper. You can get a solid state to make it slam and punch more. So more flexible in that sense. Utopia is wonderful, but I do think it does take to warmer sources. And you don't need very expensive sources. You could get a tube amp, but I think a warmer source, even a DAP like the ZM2 would work with this. This is the S009S that I talked about. It requires a warm amp. Again, I would recommend a Hollow May or Hollow sort of spring DAX for this, or even a Bifrost from Ishit. The Bifrost is thick and dense sounding, so that does add to its sense of punch and depth, because otherwise it's a bit ethereal sounding, which is not my cup of tea. The X9000 again requires amplification and very dedicated types. You need an electrostatic amplifier, but it does take to a wider variety of sources and DACs. That's that. I've talked about the Atrium close just now, so that's that. Actually haven't. The Atrium close can be driven with everything, guys. The Atrium close can be driven with a solid state, can be driven with a tube, can be driven with, a dongle even, so it's very less picky. The Aria Stealth Organic is somewhat bright in the treble, so it does take to a warmer source. One of the better mid-fi sources I've driven it with is Angel from Earman Audio. Susvara, of course, is just an amazing source, amazing headphone. And my recommended DAC for this is the Wise DAC 501, because it makes Susvara more upfront and punchy. And for amp, you can take your choice from some of the Hyphaman amps available, like your Prelude or any other amp of your choice. If you want to go all the way up to Zale or Zal HM1, you can do that, or further up to a Mascobo 475. But of course, you can even drive this with a topping amp or with a shit amp and with a variety of other amps. There are even amp manufacturers that have tuned their amplifiers with the Susvara, so it's a whole lot of amps out there. Some people even recommend the Kine solid state amp, so that's there as well. That's it, guys. I hope this review was useful. So that's my top 10. Number 1, the Susvara. Number 2, the Stax SRX9000. Number 3, the Focal Utopia. 4 Caldera, 5 AB1266, 6 Ral SR1B, 7 the ZMF Atrium closed, 8 Hyphen 81000 SE, 9 the RE Organic, and my top 10, my number 10 is the Stax SR99S. I hope this was useful, guys. If this was, give it a like and follow my work if you have not, and I'll stay tuned, and I hope you stay tuned for my next one. I'll certainly stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.